is Onchari Oyeyo. He's an international affairs expert. Thank you so much for making time.
Thank you for having me.
Right, first things first, we want to just start with Uganda. President Yoweri Museveni tested positive for COVID-19. I want to just give you a brief, experience. I was in Uganda doing an interview with the president last year, and he was very cautious.
Yes.
He was wearing a mask. There was distance between him and almost everyone.
Yes.
So he was very, very cautious when it came to COVID-19. But now he's tested positive. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's unfortunate. I wish him quick recovery.
Right.
Obviously, at 78, we all should be scared whenever that kind of thing happens because from what we witnessed at the height of COVID, all the people are particularly vulnerable. So we wish him a quick recovery and we hope he's getting the kind of medication that of course, can make him recover quickly. So I like him because he was very, very cautious, as you said, always wearing, a mask and distancing practices. I think he kept way up until after COVID was not considered such a big threat. So he's been very, very disciplined. But then again, him contracting COVID means it's a case of continued vigilance that is going to keep us all safe. Yeah. So we don't have to lower our guard. We have to be cautious and we have to always make sure we're careful. And it also, points to the idea that COVID is still around.
Yes.
And as much as we want to move on with our lives and go back to pre-COVID practices, we just have to be careful. And if someone is well guarded and as cautious as Museveni can get it, then me and you can also, pick it.
Yes.
Yeah.
And I think immediately, after COVID-19 declared it not being a public health emergency, of course, the measures that were there was not really taken seriously. And you see, for Museveni, he actually said one of the reasons he gave up the mask is because he was getting allergic reactions in his eyes and throat. But he decided to delegate some of his roles to the Prime Minister.
Yes.
That is Robina Nabanjo for 2 days.
Yes.
What does that tell you?
That is a good sign from him. At some point when you feel like you're under the weather as a president, you cannot just say, you cannot cling to power. You have to let people around you, take up some roles as you recover. So that is a good sign. And then, of course, I think COVID teaches him that it's high time he began grooming someone to take up power after he obviously he ceases to be president. Like we said, at 78, he's been president since 1986.
Right.
That is, I think, a year and a few months after I was born. So it's high time he gets prepared to seed ground and let younger people, come in and take over leadership in Uganda.
And what's interesting is this is the second time he's taking a forced leave in 53 years.
A long time.
So he's not been really taking a break. But let's talk about the politics in Uganda.
Yes.
Do you think he's ready to surrender or groom someone else, like you said, to the presidential position?
Now, unfortunately, most African presidents don't groom anybody to take power. And it's not just presidents, most politicians, even here in Kenya, we have places where we have vacuums. Like if you look at some sections of this country where you've had kingpins, we have very old kingpins, and when you look back, you don't see anyone who can take after them if something happens. So that is a culture that I think needs to be done away with. As president, when you're very old, you need to pick someone who can take over. Because as we've witnessed with the case in Sudan, if you're a strong man and you have total control of the state and you don't groom anyone, if something happens and you're out of power, the nation descends into chaos. So for the future of Uganda, I think it's high time he needs to do that. And now, fortunately, the opposition is prepared, of course, under the leadership of the musician who I consider clown.
Bobby Wine.
Yes, and then of course we have people like the Dr. Kiza, who has also been very active in making sure that the opposition in Uganda is alive and kicking. So I don't think there'll be a vacuum. But then of course it will open the ground for more political figures and forces to come into play, which I think will be good for Uganda.
What about his son, Muhoozi? We've seen the way he talks a lot on Twitter and, of course, the comments that he's even made about Kenya itself.
Muhoozi is not ready to be president, but I'm not saying he cannot be president because in Africa so many things can happen. But I think in his wildest dreams and thoughts, he's preparing himself to take over from his father, which will be quite unfortunate. So again, it's upon the opposition to get ready to make sure that does not happen, because from the way he communicates, from the way he pronounces himself, from the comments he makes, he's quite reckless for head of state. So he's not ready, and I don't think he's going to be ready at any one point. He's basically a spoiled brat.
Wow, what a way of putting it. But let's just move on now to another country. Let's go to Senegal.
Yes.
We've seen there's been a bit of tensions in the beginning of this month. Of course, the opposition figure, that is Ousmane Sonko, he was sentenced to 2 years. Of course, there's a bit of controversy surrounding that. He was charged from a massage therapist, a lot of allegations, and now this led to protests in the country and a bit of clashes with young people. What are your thoughts on that?
No, well, the crisis is not as small as the media is trying to paint it. When you follow up on what has been happening over the last, let's say, 2 years, it's quite unfortunate because Sall came in as a continuation of the long tradition of democracy in Senegal. But then he has been actually very, very proactive in coming up with fake allegations against opposition figures. He's been coming up with ways to make sure they don't become candidates in next year's election. And this is a man who knows that the Senegalese law bars anyone from taking over as president for 3 consecutive terms. So he was elected in 2012, and then, of course, in 2019, which makes him ineligible to run in next year's election. But then from the way he's behaving, it's like he's trying to crush all these guys and making sure he muddies them up enough so that he remains the only candidate.
Is that really the case? Because, you know, one of Ousmane Sonko's lawyer has been actually saying that it's a way of keeping him out of the elections. Is that factual?
Keeping who out of the election?
Keeping Ousmane Sonko.
Exactly.
From standing.
Now, that is factual if you ask me. This guy is trying to make sure all these opposition candidates if to say muddied up, you know, they are not able to come out and be candidates in next year's election. And then, of course, there's a dialogue that is going on, and they've made some conditions in which Mark Sall said if he cannot be a candidate in next year's election, which of course he cannot be under the current law, he has to continue running the nation up to 2026 in the name of trying to restore order. So basically, we have a picture of a man who is trying to behave like President Paul Kagame. He wants to be a president for more than the constitution allowed 2 terms. So that is the basis of all the, you know, shenanigans we are seeing. And this happens because the peer review Professor Nyama was pushing for at some point, which has to take place in Africa, whereby presidents can check what their colleagues are doing, does not take place. So if I'm a Kenyan president, I get so immersed in Kenyan affairs that I don't get to see what's happening in the neighborhood. So this guy has been cooking up schemes to make himself, again, a candidate in next year's election. So that is the kind of attention we need to pay as Africans, as far as our neighbors are concerned, so as to make sure this does not happen. So he has been left alone, and in his head he thinks he can violate the law or even manipulate it and continue running the country beyond the legally acceptable 2 terms.
But what does that tell you about democracy in Africa? Do you think it's just a pattern? We've seen it, like you said, Rwanda, there's Uganda. Is it a pattern?
Democracy dies in darkness. That is what happens. Anytime vigilance is lowered, you'll find all these cartoons who rise to power trying to perpetuate themselves into eternity. So there has to be a constant observation, constant safeguarding, constant scrutiny by civil society and the international community, all these organizations, to make sure these guys who are elected into office don't go against the democratically, you know, laid down principles which are meant to safeguard civilians, democracy itself, rule of law, and the culture that has been established over a long period of time. Yes. So because I think this guy has been left unchecked, in his head he feels he can go ahead and do all the things he's doing and then continue running the country beyond the end of his term next year. It's I think 8 months to the election, and of course there's what we call the boosting of his nonsensical ideas by what he sees happening around here. If he looks at Rwanda, he sees a president who wants to be president for life. If he looks at Uganda, he sees a president who's been president since 1986.
Right.
You know, so there's this retrogressive culture which boosts his nonsensical ideas of wanting to run for president in the 2024 election. But then we expect progressive forces of democracy to come out in support of the opposition figures and the civilians who don't want him to continue being president beyond 2024.
I want us to go back to what you talked about earlier on the peer review, where the presidents are like checking what you talked about. Do you think it's possible, really?
That is very possible, because In as much as the number of basket cases is rising, we have a few guys who are very respectful when it comes to respect to rules of democracy. Now, these guys can have, they can rejuvenate this body, and then they make it active. From time to time, they move to a particular country, they look at the practices, the culture, and then they make sure they criticize what is to be criticized, and they cheer or support what stands out as progressive. In that way, they can apply pressure on these dictatorial cartoons to make sure they're reminded that when your time comes, kindly exit. Yes.
What do you think of international community, just coming into all this? Because we saw United States yesterday through the Secretary of State, that is Blinken, talking about respect for democracy, because as of yesterday, 16 people were reported dead.
Yes. Now, the international community can help, but not in every case, because when you look at the history of support of some countries, for example, by the United States, you'll find at some point they supported the dictators, people who actually ended up repressing and oppressing their people. If you go to South America, people like Agostino Pinochet were supported by the Americans. If you go to places like El Salvador, there are all this, even in Haiti, we have cases of guys who are really bad, supported by the Americans. So the international community can only be useful, not in every case, but in some cases. So in Senegal, I think they're right. Democracy has to be respected. And then it's upon Africans to actually make sure that democracy at this point in time is protected. We cannot expect outsiders, like I've always said, to come in and organize our house. It's our duty. It's the duty of the African Union to make sure progressive voices are supported, boosted, and given the energy they need to keep our presidents, prime ministers, and other heads of government and states in check.
In check, for sure.
Yes.
Let's move on now to Sudan. Finally, the country that I want us to talk about. 7 weeks of battle in that particular area. Yesterday, actually, we saw there's some dead bodies actually piling up on the streets of Khartoum.
Very sad.
Yeah, which is pretty sad. What are your thoughts on whatever that's happening there at the moment?
The Sudanese crisis is not going to be resolved anytime soon. And after I witnessed the withdrawal of the quartet, that is the Americans, the Saudis, the Britons, and the Emiratis, I felt sad, because now we're talking about strong forces, for the resolution of the crisis pulling out, and in its place now you have the African Union, which to me has always been very weak. So I felt sad. That is a very, very negative turn. And if the leaders of Sudan love their country, they need to understand that the future of Sudan is in the hands. It's not in the hands of the African Union or the Americans or the Saudis or another person. So it's upon the Army General and the RSF leader to know that the destiny of Sudan lies squarely on their hands. If they continue with the kind of behavior they have now, it's going to be quite unfortunate. And something we need to be very careful about is the calling for a ceasefire, which was done by the African Union immediately they took over. You cannot call for a ceasefire when you have two forces which are not equal, number one, and then they don't have equal legitimacy. The Sudan Armed Forces is a legitimate body, founded under the rule of law, supported by the constitution of the nation. It has a right to exist. Now, the RSF was a side force, a militia basically, which was created by Bashir. So it does not have any claim to authority or power. And now, when you look at the map of the nation, it's just the western portion and then the capital city where you find RSF. It's not in other places. In fact, if you go to places like the northern part of the country, the eastern part, you'll find people doing their businesses as usual. But in the capital, Khartoum, and the western portion, you'll find these guys have gone to hospitals, they've gone to schools, they've taken control of power facilities. They've basically destroyed everything because they don't have the discipline that is usually instilled in the armed forces. They cannot kill civilians, they cannot destroy civilian infrastructure. The RSF does not have that. That is the kind of atrocity they went and inflicted on the people of Darfur, because the RSF was basically the Janjaweed, because the same guy he met is the same guy who was leading the forces that destroyed the culture, infrastructure, and everything in Darfur. So he has carried the same barbarism to Sudan. So what needs to happen is for the African Union to take note of that. We are not talking about two forces which are equal. We are not talking about two forces which have the same discipline. And they need to call upon RSF to actually stop what they are doing. And the Sudan Armed Forces has to be strengthened. It has to be supported. And that is where the quartet got it wrong. They went in and called for a ceasefire, as if the two forces are the same and equal. They are not.
They're not equal.
They are not equal.
I want us to talk about the role of humanitarian agencies in that country. You know, over 300 orphans have been caught in the ceasefire, in the crossfire rather. 67 have been dead. What role do you think the humanitarian agencies are playing, and are they playing it enough, if I could put it that way?
Now, humanitarian aid is never sufficient in that kind of conflict, because we're talking about, if you go to a place where we have disciplined armies fighting, humanitarian aid is very possible, because when you put on a jacket showing press or UN or Red Cross, you respect it. But these guys from the RSF, these are not military guys we're talking about. We're basically talking about guys who were assembled from villages and given weapons. So they don't respect humanitarian aid workers. That is where you can find UN employees being hesitant to go to some places. That is for the reason why the orphans you're talking about, the sick people in hospitals, cannot get the kind of aid they need. Once again, if support has to be given, it has to be given to the Sudan Armed Forces to actually be able to push the RSF completely down. So we need sanctions against RSF. If possible, like I said last time, the leader of RSF needs to be killed very quickly.
Oh, that is a very...
That is my personal, you know.
Yeah.
Because we're talking about a very small force which is quite barbaric in its, pursuit of power. And I think because of giving them recognition and attention, they feel like they have to keep on pushing. If I misbehave and you encourage me with that, I'll again misbehave even more.
Right.
So the more they keep on talking about ceasefire, negotiations and stuff like that, the longer the crisis, goes on, and then of course we're going to lose more people. That's what's going to happen.
Right.
Yeah.
Thank you so much. That is Onchari Oyeyo. He is an international affairs expert, of course, talking about what has been happening in the continent in the last week. That's it for Africa Speaks. Thank you for watching. My name is Fatia Mohammed Noor. I'll leave you with a proverb of the day.